Welcome to the Module Ecosystem, the Stress of Success talk. My name is Dominykas Blyze. I'm a developer at NearForm. Thank you.
Sorry.
I've been using Node a while. Most of the time, I'm just writing some code for the clients, trying to get, to keep the users happy, which does occasionally mean that to achieve that, I do have to deal with the open source packages. Now, this presentation, it contains some links. I just tweeted out a gist with all of those links if you want to follow along.
Great, and we do have that link in the slide deck, so you can find them afterwards as well. I'm Michael Dawson, IBM's community lead for Node.js. And what that means is I get to spend a lot of time working in the community. I'm an active collaborator, part of the technical steering committee. And I also get to be part of a lot of the working groups and teams. And in particular, we're going to talk about the work of one of those teams, the package maintenance team, today. I also get to work with a lot of great teams within IBM itself. And it's a really nice combination. So to start out with, I'll just give you a little bit of idea of what we want to go through. So a little while ago, we figured out or sort of recognized a number of problems that we see in the ecosystem, and we want to introduce those issues. We then want to think about and explain some of the things we think that we can do to make things better. We'll then go into some of the details of specifically, what are we working on in the package maintenance team to try and make progress on those ideas. And then hopefully we'll have you really excited and want to get involved and work with us, so we'll have a call of action and information on how you might be able to do that.
OK, so the problems. Those problems, they come from the phenomenal growth that Node.js has experienced over the past 10 years. And that growth has unlocked a huge potential, and a lot of actual value is being delivered. There's been a lot of modules released in the ecosystem. In just the last 2 years, we doubled again. And we're up to 1 million modules that are out there in the public registry. And these modules are starting to get used in a lot of critical applications where it is important that these applications continue working, right? And these modules, they're all interconnected between themselves, right? One is depending on the other. And for those modules to continue working, businesses start to need some basic maintenance to be performed there. And by basic maintenance, we usually mean things like, do they run in the recommended Node versions, which is the LTS most of the time? Are the security issues addressed in a timely manner? And are the dependencies up to date, once again, mostly to be able to push through, to bubble up the security fixes through the whole dependency chain? In some cases, we even saw this year that it can take months for security issues to bubble up through all of the dependents of a deep dependency. Now, once NPM audits came out, and also tools like SNCC, maintainers started to get a lot of pressure to address these issues, right? So you get the users of packages coming into the issue trackers and shouting at the maintainers, fix my thing. And that leads to a lot of negativity. It leads to burnout, which makes your dependency tree even worse, because if your maintainer burns out, then they're not maintaining the package. And obviously, the dependency tree continues to rot. There's also similar problems in communicating these issues, right? There's a bit of a lack of communication channels. So the maintainers, they don't really have a way to talk to their users, to push out the messages to their users. So we've seen a proliferation of, for example, the post-install messages or certain things inside the package deprecation notices. At the same time, businesses do not necessarily know how to interact and how to join the maintainers, how to help them out. And helping out what the maintainers need in terms of help, that also varies a lot, right? In some cases, you have maintainers who are potentially opinionated. They also prefer tight control of their code. Sometimes it's because it's their brand. Sometimes it's because that's how they built up the trust. These maintainers would probably want to get paid for their work. There's other maintainers who want to grow their communities, who want to grow the people, who want to get more people involved in some cases in building the code. In other cases, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done that is related, that is the non-technical work, right? The issue triage, the documentation writing, and I mean, it is hard to determine which piece of this actual work delivers the most value. And you know, most of us do like writing code, but who here loves writing documentation more than they love writing code?
I see 3 people. So.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't expect to see many hands either. So, but this does bring a lot of value because documentation itself, it unlocks the potential of many other users of the project, right? In some other cases, the maintainers, they consider their module done. They just want to get it over with, they want to deprecate it, or in some cases, these modules are very deeply ingrained in the ecosystem, and you know, they would maybe like to hand it over. And over the past years, we've seen that not go entirely well in some cases, which led to, you know, outrage by more people. And in some cases, they're looking for a safe home for the package, possibly you know, handing it over to a foundation or to another group of developers. And so, yeah, how we can help.
Right, so next we want to think about, like, how can we make things better? So one of the first things that often leads to sort of friction, disagreement, or stress is when there's a mismatch between expectations. You know, people, I think, generally want to work together and have a good faith expectation that that's the way they're going to work. But if you have differing expectations, that can often be really difficult. So one of the things we want to work on is providing ways that we can close the gap between expectations between the users and the people who are maintaining the packages. So work on tools, processes, or whatever that are going to help us do that. Related is of course, very, very much communication. The closer the communication we can have between the users and the maintainers, the less misunderstandings, the smaller gaps between expectations. And so having that flow of information is important. We can see that, you know, most recently with some of the maintainers basically trying to get the messages out to the people who are using their packages in terms of, like, help, we need some support. So we can see some clear indications that that's something people are struggling with. It's also important, we think, to close and provide better communication between maintainers themselves. There's a lot of common activity and common work that there's no point for people to reinvent the wheel themselves every time. And in fact, if we can reuse some best practices, it'll make everybody's life easier and the sort of overall work a smaller amount and make things go better. And of course, if we can just pull in, you know, better communication throughout the entire ecosystem, we think that's going to help as well. The next thing we think we can do is to help make it easier to maintain packages. So develop tools, best practices, so that there's just overall less work that has to go into maintaining your, you know, the regular routine stuff that you need to do to have a package versus focusing on the extra value that you deliver. And then the last thing is working on promoting responsible and sustainable consumption of the modules. If you look at it from, say, you know, a business's perspective, if you're using modules and, you know, it probably makes sense for you to actually contribute back to those. And if you can better understand the state of those modules, how you might get involved, you can actually manage your own risk. So not just from the perspective of, you know, it's the right thing to do in terms of contributing back, but also for your own interest and your own good, getting involved. And so we think we can do work on that front to help you know, the users of modules understand what they're using, where their risks are, and hopefully motivate them to get involved in terms of supporting those packages to make it, you know, a more sustainable ecosystem overall. So about a year ago, we formed the Node.js package maintenance team. And it really started out by a few of us looking at the success of the Node LTS strategy. If you remember yesterday, Beth gave us a little bit of a history of the Node.js project. And one of the things we found that's been very successful was the introduction of LTS, where we have a stable and predictable release schedule for the Node releases. And we were thinking, wouldn't it be great if we had something similar in the package ecosystem and which was tied to the releases of Node.js? So we came up with this concept of module LTS. When we started talking about that to people in the ecosystem, though, we quickly realized that there was kind of a larger problem that we needed to solve first, because, you know, module maintainers, as Dominykas has mentioned, you know, in some cases we're just struggling to keep up. So saying and talking to them about adding in some extra level of support was just not the right place to start. So we thought we needed to start on how do we solve those problems first. Around the same time, we had the event stream issue. which really raised the profile of what can happen if you hand off a module, and raised the level of interest in the module ecosystem and sort of the supply chain there. So that actually helped to bring a lot of interested people to the issue as well. We have representation from a good cross-section. We have people who are using modules. We have the package maintainers. We have people from the Node.js collaborators, because of course the module ecosystem is very important to the success of Node itself. We have representatives from NPM. And I guess I'll throw out, does it make sense for you to be involved as well? We would like to have as many people contributing as possible. So as we go through this, think about maybe this is something you'd want to get involved in. And really what the package maintenance team is a place for us to get together and work together on these ideas, share our experience, and try and figure out what will make things better, because we don't have all the answers. Some of the specific things we're doing today is we started out by saying, well, let's understand a little bit more about the ecosystem. Let's look at some of the numbers. As engineers and software developers, we like data, so we started by looking at that. We're working on something we call support info, which is adding additional metadata that will hopefully help us close that gap between expectations. Working on best practices that module maintainers are free to do whatever they want, but if you don't have a better reason to choose to do something in a particular way, maybe you just want to adopt a best practice that somebody's already figured out how to do. We're looking at patterns of engagement. If I had 100 developers and pointed them all at a particular package that said, go contribute, that actually might be worse for the maintainers in terms of way more PRs they have to review. And so we want to figure out patterns of engagement that actually work. So we're experimenting with a few modules to figure out what does work before we roll it out to a larger scale. And then finally, we're looking at some tooling. So we'll go into details on each of those.
Right. OK, so understanding the package ecosystem, the state of the ecosystem, we're taking a look at both, a sort of a qualitative overview of what's going on, and we're taking a look at some numbers. So we have a survey. The link is, on the slide you have a link to some answers from the pilot packages that we're engaging with. So that's MQTT and Express.js. So feel free to take a look at the issues that they're facing, but also feel free to fill out the survey if you're a maintainer as well to give us more information. There is, the survey is asking the questions about what problems are maintainers facing, what are the tasks that they don't necessarily, do well at, and trying to also understand what is the impact of dependencies. One common theme in there is that, issue triage and general support of the users is a problem. So in your day job, it is quite likely that you actually have a separate department dealing with all of that, whereas in open source, it is up to the maintainers, and it is taking a toll. And then we looked at some numbers. So in April, NPM released a list of top 1,000 most downloaded packages. So we figured, OK, let's see what's going on in these top 1,000 packages. And the first question we asked is, are these packages active? Are they being, are they getting fresh releases? Are they being maintained? And what we found is that around 40% of those packages had a release in the last 6 months, which is not bad at all, right? It means that they're alive. But we also saw that around 40% of other packages haven't had a release in over a year. And that was a little bit concerning, right? Because in a year, you get two new major Node.js versions. One of those is LTS. And if they haven't released in a year, are they actually supporting that new version of Node? Have they tested in that version? So we took a look at the Git repositories, and we scanned the Travis YAML files to determine the list of Node versions that they're testing in. And what we found is that around a third of the packages were not actively testing in the current active latest LTS version. It does not necessarily mean that there's maintainers to blame for the disrepair. There's a bit of a case there that the configuration of Travis, by default, it does not test in the LTS version, which is something we're talking to them about changing. And there's an issue open where they will hopefully update that soon enough. So that meant that some of these packages would have been testing in, for example, Node 12 and Node 11, but not Node 10 and then in Node 8, right? So there's some gaps in there. We recently published a blog post around which versions of Node you should be ideally testing in your CI. So follow the link and read for more details. And when we saw that people are not necessarily updating as often as we might want them to, we took a look at the outdated dependencies as well. Now, we have to keep in mind that this is the top 1,000 packages, so they are at the deepest levels of your dependency tree, right? So they don't have many dependencies themselves. They usually depend on the same top 1,000 there internally. But what we found there, what we saw there, is that around 20% had some dependencies which were outdated, which were not the latest versions, which may be a little bit concerning. We also saw that around a half of those that do have dependencies have outdated dev dependencies. This number could be taken with a bit of a grain of salt because dev dependencies, when you update dev dependencies, you don't need to push out a new NPM release. So this number is from looking at the package JSON rather than the Git repository. So if the dependencies are not up to date, there could potentially be some security problems there. So if you were to install the top 1,000 in your package JSON, the good news is that both NPM audit and SNCC would report that there are no known vulnerabilities in these packages. And I think that the maintainers deserve a round of applause for keeping us safe.
Yeah.
So that's the good news. And there's only 7 deprecation warnings that you actually get there, which means that at least from the intent perspective, there's probably good news there.
Right, so now we're going to start to dive into some of the specific things we're working on to try and implement those ideas of what we thought would make things better. And one of the things we mentioned was like closing the gap between expectations. And so we've worked on something we've called support info, and this is additional metadata which we think would be useful for all packages. And it's data that we hope to have tools to be able to process. So similar to like a license check, you'd be able to run a tool and get a good summary of this information and how it would impact you as a consumer of those modules. Some of the key attributes about the data is it's in JSON, so it's it's tooling friendly but also fairly readable. It's consistent, we think, with what's in the package.json. When we were talking about the structure and the elements, we did focus on what we'd need for the JavaScript community, but it was also pointed out, and we focused on making sure that we didn't do anything that would preclude it from being used in other communities. So we actually think it might be useful for a lot of other communities as well. And finally, it's important to point out it's a draft. We've had quite a lot of discussions within the package maintenance team itself, and we're just about at the point where we really want to get much broader input. So if you can take a look and give us your feedback, we'd really appreciate that. Within the support info, there's 3 key elements. One is the target. Which is basically information about the intent of what node versions the maintainer wants to support. So it's different from the engines field in that it doesn't say I support node 10 or node 11. It's more of a high-level intent. For example, I want to support, or I intend to support all LTS versions. So when there's a new LTS version, that means you should expect support for that new LTS version. And when an LTS version goes out of service, there's going to be, we're going to drop support for that LTS version. So it's more, to provide an ongoing view into what the intent is in terms of what's supported. The next field is response, to give an idea of how quickly you can probably get support or answers to questions if you're using the module and run into problems. And that can range anywhere from like, well, don't expect any support at all to, you can get 24/7 paid support. And then finally, the last one is backing, which is to give you an idea of what kind of support is there for the module? Is it something that I'm just maintaining for myself as a hobby? Or is it something that is part of a foundation, there's a company behind it, and so forth? If we look at one of the examples, this is the sort of outlying structure. We can see that the backing field has a whole bunch of different options. And we've defined sort of a terminology or a dictionary for these fields, but our intent is that people can add to these. If there's other things or versions that fit into here, feel free to PR them in. One of the things that's particularly relevant to some of the conversation that we've seen in the community is around support. And being able to provide information on how you can be supported. So in this case, if your module is sponsored, being able to provide links on how to provide that sponsorship. I think related is you may have seen that NPM has a new feature called NPM funding. And they did actually look at a lot of the work that we were doing here, took some inspiration. And we sort of see that as a first step towards providing this sort of larger set of support information along with that kind of information. The next piece is the target, as I said, and you can see the different options there. And really the key thing is that it's around the intent as opposed to any specific node versions. And then finally, the next one is the response. And here's where you can provide information in terms of like, well, just don't bother me because I'm not providing any support at all, to yes, you can actually get support, either unpaid support through these URLs, these contacts, or paid support through some other mechanisms. So that's kind of the biggest thing, one of the biggest things we've been working on. But at the same time, we've also been working on other best practices. So we actually have either drafts or released versions of best practices for things like testing. We've already mentioned just support info, how to do versioning, how to do licensing, how to deprecate. If you go to the repo, you can see that we have ones at both the sort of doc level and the doc drafts. So you should look in those too. But that's along the idea of like, let's document something that unless you have a good reason or you want to invent something for yourself, here's some best practices you can just adopt and make your life easier as a maintainer. The next thing we've been doing is, as I mentioned, working on patterns of engagement. And that's where we want to work with a couple of pilot packages, experiment, figure out what works. Because just bringing new people to a project doesn't always make things better for the maintainers. We're currently working with Express. And as Dominykas mentioned earlier, one of the top things they've raised is they could really use help with triage, answering questions. The two other things that we've come up with as ways to sort of focus the engagement is a top 10 list, so that when people come in and help with particular issues, they work on issues that the maintainers wish they'd just done themselves. And so if they have to spend time to review them, they still see that as a net benefit, as opposed to something that's maybe their second, third, or fourth priority. So having a list of top 10. And then finally, there's the area of like, there's often some bigger issues where you need experience in multiple domains. So for example, how would you bring HTTP2 to Express? And that's like, how do we actively engage people who have HTTP2 experience to work with the Express maintainers to move something like that forward? Along the way, there's been some tooling that's been worked on. So for example, Wesley Todd has worked on the status board to help provide insight to what those top 10 might be, what are the projects that all make up Express, because some of these larger projects have more than one repository. And we've also been working on the triage front to kind of say, like, how do we document how you would get engaged in Express? What's the way to tag things? And how do we make people comfortable getting engaged in the project, even if they don't think they're experts, because the maintainers are saying, in a lot of cases, they'll still really value that input and help. So that, that's one of the key things we've looked at. Now,
right. Part of the tasks that we're trying to do is building some tooling to basically make it easier to maintain packages. There's some tools that Wesley has already published. So one is the package.js support. It validates the schema that we define for the for the package support information. The other one is as part of the package support, we've defined the intended versions to support, and we've defined some keywords for that. So, for example, you could say that my package is only going to support LTS versions, which right now is 8, 10, and 12. Will soon become just 10 and 12, right? So NV allows you to get meta information, to resolve the meta information about these packages, about these versions from the keywords. The status board that Michael already mentioned, it basically gives an overview of a large organization with multiple repositories because we like our packages small in Node ecosystem. The other tools that we're just starting to work on and to deal with, it's publishing with dual-factor authentication from CI. So right now, we know that less than 1% of packages are published using the second factor approval, which means that if somebody's token gets stolen, malicious actors could be publishing malicious packages. And soon, NPM will start disclosing the information whether these packages were published with 2FA. And we can probably expect some of the increase in activity around that, same as we had when NPM audit came out, when packages are starting to be highlighted as vulnerable. So we might see people go and push maintainers to use 2FA, which is kind of tricky because you can npm publish from your local machines, right? But that involves, in some cases, running some build scripts before that, making sure that you're on the right branch. There's tooling that helps you do that, but if you are in a team, then you need to make sure that the whole team uses that tooling and they commonly support it. So one way to solve that is to set up your CI to automatically publish based on some meta criteria, be it commit messages or for something like semantic release or similar approaches. However, if you publish from CI, there is no built-in way to enter the one-time password, which means that, as you npm install on CI, somebody could steal your token and you're back where you started. So solving that is not entirely an obvious option, not entirely an obvious, there's no obvious solutions. We are discussing several. There's a pull request open in the repo. Please add your ideas. Please give us some feedback. Most of the ideas circle around having some sort of a release manager, which will basically give you an overview, which will possibly stage your release be it in GitHub releases or alternative registries and allow you to publish en masse while accepting the OTP. Alternatively, there could be some sort of an asynchronous API where your CI could possibly make a request. You receive a notification on your phone or Slack, and you enter the OTP that way, and then the CI can continue publishing the package, which means that there's still a human involved, and there isn't a single point of failure where people can start doing bad stuff. In the future, there's a couple of other issues that we really want to work on. One is we know that Node's LTS long-term support has been a success. So ideally, some of the critical packages would also offer LTS support of their own. So there's some guidelines and automation to be built around that. Node also has a canary in the goldmine tool, which means that upcoming Node versions, there's a tool that runs tests of the packages, the critical packages in the ecosystem against Node nightlies, essentially. So there are packages that have their own ecosystems around them. So things like Express, they have plugins, Fastify, Happy, even loggers, right, like take Pino or Winston, they have plugins related to what they do. And ideally, we'd be able to offer them practices and tooling to essentially test their upcoming version of their package with all the related packages in that same ecosystem.
OK, so we really want to just close out with a call to action. Hopefully, if you're a package user or a maintainer or somebody else in the community, it'd be great if you came out and helped us figure this all out. We have meetings every 2 weeks. We meet at 9 Eastern and 3 Eastern. Those are the time zones I understand. But we have 2 different ones so that we can have Europe-friendly and Americas-friendly meetings. If you can't make it to the meetings, if you can come to GitHub and review what we're doing, validate and comment, and really let us know what works for you. So thank you very much for listening to us, and we hope to talk to you about this further.